This week, Marvel tried to do Sam Wilson Captain America again. They've been attempting to make this a thing for, I think, over a decade now, since Rick Remender put the stars and stripes and the shield on Falcon. Once Rick Remender leaves and you get another writer in and he basically becomes Obama Cap, the character's voice and cadence became unrecognizable. One of the reasons I think Sam Wilson Captain America doesn't work, besides the fact that he's not Steve Rogers, but he's also saddled down with the idea that he can't just be another version of Captain America. He has to be the Black Captain America, much like the same way that John Kent can't be the heir apparent to Superman. He has to be a gay Superman. And then everything about the story has to be about gay stuff. Everything about Steve Rogers being Captain America has to be about him being black. And it's not really about so much black culture, which would be much more interesting. It's always about, you're a black guy and you're Captain America, man. You should be really furious that you were oppressed and all these types of things. And that's really the only thing that the story can be about. So they brought in Greg Pak, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because he's normally only allowed to write Asian characters. But as a backup, they brought in Evan Narcisse. Now, Greg Pak back in the day actually did some pretty cool things, most notably World War Hulk. Hasn't been the same guy for a long time. Evan Narcisse never really has had a competent comic book published with his name on it, and that trend continues here. Just not a very good writer, but that's kind of what you would expect from a guy that kicked off his career like IO9. Wants to be influential, wants to be a part of the comic book industry, not to tell good stories, to use it as a platform to talk about racism and things of that nature, which is basically all this #1 comic book is about. It's pretty darn embarrassing, especially the art from Eder Macias, which is not very good. Everyone's kind of got stroke face. A little bit of a bait and switch. You got a Torrin Clark, I think, cover that's very sleek and stylized, looks like a movie poster. And then when you open the book, it looks like dog shit. Not quite the worst comic book at Marvel these days, but very, very close. Just looks like crap all around, but it reads like crap, so I guess it makes sense. The opening scenes, we have Sam Wilson stopping vampires from eating a bunch of people, going to a soup kitchen. Steve Rogers comes along, gives him a little bit of aid, and then he's like, hey, you didn't need my help. You're an awesome Captain America. In fact, you might even be better than me. And then Sam's like, hey, I'm going to a barbecue, and I've got big plans, but if you wanted to, you could come along with me. And then we realize that this isn't just any barbecue. This is a blacks only superhero barbecue. Steve Rogers was invited to just to talk about white guilt and kind of stuff like that and make Steve feel bad for his immutable traits and all that kind of stuff. Very, very modern stuff. This is a very modern comic book. And to me, the idea that every black superhero in the Marvel Comics universe just has barbecues together and don't invite anyone else out there is so many steps back in our society. I do not get the idea that somehow like modern segregation is progress. Like that's what the far left would like. Everyone should segregate themselves. You can only have your own culture. You shouldn't be cross-assimilating. You shouldn't be, sharing people's cultures and stuff like that, because that's appropriation. We need to just all, box ourselves in with only people that look like us. Whereas when I think of superheroes, I think of the ultimate morality play. People that are beyond looking at people and judging them by the color of their skin. Because it's Black Captain America, we can only tell one type of story. We can only talk about oppression and things like that. Not that you can't have a Sam Wilson Captain America story, dig into those type of ideas in an interesting way, but they do it in the least interesting way possible, promoting segregation among superheroes where it doesn't even make sense for that community to want to do that or even to think that it was normal. But people are kind of turning their back on this new wave progressivism where segregation is the key and that we shouldn't share things and that can only belong to this culture and that can only belong to that culture, whereas we can't be a great melting pot, which is basically what America's always stood for. And certainly Captain America is supposed to champion those type of ideas, the great melting pot of the world. But you don't get that in this comic book because these writers just don't see Sam Wilson as Captain America being able to be a Captain America and really represent everybody. He can only represent one group of people because he's a black man. He can only represent black superheroes. He would only want to talk to other black superheroes. And he gave a pity invite to Steve Rogers. And the only reason he invited Steve Rogers is for a little bit of white guilt, which we will get here in a few seconds. But the reason that they're there is there's a big birthday party for Elijah Bradley, who's an interesting character. And I kind of understand why Elijah Bradley kind of exists. Definitely an analog to like the Tuskegee Airmen and other Black hero Americans in history that were not treated very well. In fact, were treated very, very poorly. And Sam didn't just bring Steve. He also brought his cousin Billy, or his sister Billy. I think it's his cousin, but I might be wrong on that one. She just wants to talk to Storm. And we get this really stupid line from Misty Knight. And this is the type of dialogue you get throughout the comic book, which I'm going to equate to Evan Narcisse. I imagine they hired Greg Pak to do the book, but they're like, shit, he's not Black. We need to hire somebody else to do the dialogue so we can get shit like this. Yeah, babe, you can't get between a Black woman and Storm. And you're just like, it's so embarrassing. And of course, Steve Rogers, not the only military guy in the room. He's the only one that needs to salute Elijah Bradley because he's the one that should feel bad about himself. Rhodey doesn't need to salute him. Sam doesn't need to salute him. Only Steve Rogers needs to salute him. And there's quite a few moments where Steve has to really check himself. Like, oh, I've just been so privileged throughout my life because I'm a white character, you know, despite the fact that I got frozen in solid ice for years, despite the fact that I had my young charge basically die and then come back as an assassin trying to kill me. That wasn't a great moment in his life. He got sent to Dimension Z or whatever for several years. A lot of bad things have happened to Steve Rogers over the years. He's died, actually been murdered a couple of times. Remember, he became a fucking werewolf. It's not like Steve Rogers has had the best life in the history of the world. Now, we can't really acknowledge all that stuff because he's just a privileged character. Yes, he's a superhero and he's been through some bad things, but he's a white superhero. And really, that's what this comic book is about. It's about white shaming. It's about guilt. It's about Black people can only be oppressed. They're never in charge of their own agency and stuff like that. They're just being kept down by the man. And we get a great moment from Steve Rogers for no really reason whatsoever, just because he's in the presence of other Black superheroes, says, just thinking about how lucky I've had it and why. Oh, you know why you've been so lucky, Steve. It's because you're white privilege. You should feel guilty. Look at all these brown superheroes. They've all had it really tough. You know, Miles Morales, he's got a 2-parent home with his dad's a police officer, never had to want for anything. You could never know what it's like to be as oppressed as a Miles Morales. And certainly Elijah Bradley falls into the category of somebody within the story elements that's actually been oppressed, but it just kind of comes out of nowhere. But that's why Steve is in the story. Steve isn't in the story because he's a wanted guest. He's not in the story because they're like, wow, the actual living embodiment of the American spirit, Captain fucking America, has decided to come to Uncle Elijah's birthday or whatever. No, he needs to acknowledge that he's privileged and he needs to apologize for it and contemplate on all the bad things that have happened to all these wonderful people that he's never had to experience because his immutable traits basically preclude him from having anything really bad happen to him, or certainly acknowledging all the trials and tribulations that a Captain America Steve Rogers has been through. And it just becomes downright embarrassing that they even included him in here. And, you know, you feel bad, not only for Steve Rogers, a fictional character. And I probably shouldn't really feel bad for a fictional character doing a cameo, but I feel bad for Joe Simon. I feel bad for Jack Kirby. I feel bad for the creators of Captain America or anybody else out there like Mark Grunwald that put their heart and soul into this character. And now he's not so much vilified. He can only represent, you know, white privilege within a comic book like this. And that's why it's so embarrassing. Like I said, just go read the dialogue. It's absolutely terrible. But the story itself, when you get into it, it's equally terrible. You have this idea that these guys, I think they're called Eagle Tech. I might be wrong on that one, but they've created 12 floating cities over America, which is exactly the same thing that Storm has done over Atlanta. And they're like leasing out the land to poor Black farmers that have lost their farms because bankers are evil. And even then, on a floating platform with supposedly arable land that's just over America, and Falcon Cap is supposed to be looking at what's going on here and deciding whether or not he wants to invest in this. Guess what we got? They don't just get some arable land to farm. They got 40 acres in a mule. Of course, it's not a real mule. It's like a robotic mule. And that's the worst thing about Sam Wilson being Captain America, is he just gets pigeonholed into garbage like this. It's so fundamentally uncreative. But this is the only type of garbage storytelling that you're even allowed to do from Marvel Comics when it comes to a character like Sam Wilson, Captain America. And it's not just a comic book thing. Did you watch Falcon and the Winter Soldier? What happens as soon as Sam Wilson puts on the Captain America suit? He fundamentally becomes a completely different character. All of a sudden, he's Obama Cap once again. It's an enormous turnoff. And you've once again shoehorned the character in to being something that he'll never be able to escape from. And that's why Captain America can never be Sam Wilson, because you're not allowed to do anything interesting with the character. He's not allowed to be Captain America. Whereas back in the day, Rhodey did become Iron Man. Now, it wasn't for a long time. It was temporary, because those type of mantle swaps should be ultimately very temporary. But it wasn't only focused on, oh my goodness, you're the first Black Iron Man. What are you going to do? You've been oppressed your entire life. What stories do you want to tell? No, he was just Iron Man. He was trying to keep the Iron Man legacy and everything moving forward, while Tony Stark was dealing with his alcoholism, which he'd been driven into by Obadiah Stane and all that kind of stuff. But modern writers can't do anything but tell the exact same story over and over again. And it's so blasé and boring and cliche at this point, even when you get the big reveal on Red Hulk. So they've got these floating cities with 40 acres and a mule for minority plot owners, so they can get some arable land and get their farms going once again. And for some reason, this company has created metal pteranodons. I'm not joking. These metal pteranodons come down, and Red Wing goes wild and all that stuff. And then Sam Wilson takes it down, and he realizes there's an Eagle Star logo on a metal pteranodon that never made sense to begin with. And he's like, you've got some splaining to do. And then the dude goes, my apologies. I just scanned Sam Wilson, and this is a life model decoy, Mr. Maverick. And then Red Hulk decides he's going to kill him. If you were going to create metal pteranodons to attack the farmers who you gave this land to, why would you put your logo on it? Or why would you give them the land if you only wanted to attack them with metal prehistoric flying reptiles? Like, I don't even get what the story was supposed to be. And that's the big aha moment. And that's when we see that Red Hulk is going to come out and he's going to fight Sam Wilson. Of course, Sam Wilson is not a super soldier. He's never had the super soldier serum. He doesn't really have any superpowers whatsoever. And if Red Hulk gets a pinky blow on him, it will kill him. But we have to ignore that stuff because there's a movie featuring a big fight between Red Hulk and Sam Wilson, Captain America. And of course, that movie is the only reason this comic book is still coming out. But the problem is, while they won't give it up, he's absolutely pigeonholed on which stories you're even allowed to tell. You can only tell one story, and it's that he was oppressed. And Steve Rogers should feel very ashamed of himself. And I should feel ashamed. And if you're a white person out there, you should feel ashamed. And you should feel very, very bad for Sam Wilson because he's had it horribly. And because of Steve Rogers' white privilege, he's had it absolutely fantastically. Even though that's not really the history of Marvel Comics and the things that Captain America have gone through, they just ignore all that stuff and keep hiring hacks like Evan Narcisse and Greg Pak to ruin the character over and over again, and it will never work. This was an embarrassing comic book. And I will be very shocked if when we get to the end of 2025 and I do my worst comic books of 2025, this isn't in the top 10. Probably not top 5 because Sam Wilson as Captain America isn't important enough to really warrant a spot on there. But I will continue to check it out because at this point, it's such a bad car wreck. I'm actually intrigued just to see how bad it can get. Can it get worse than the first issue? I think Evan Narcisse and Greg Pak as a creative pairing are just good enough to write the worst Captain America, the worst Sam Wilson story at the exact same time in the history of Marvel Comics. I think that they can do it. If you like what I'm doing here, talking about comic books and certainly talking about another swing and miss on the part of Marvel Comics with Sam Wilson, Captain America, and you would like to support our mission here on Think Critical YouTube, the best place to do that is Think Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. Lots of bonus content on there in the form of podcasts, extra videos, polls, stuff like that. Hope to see you really soon as we continue to check in on a very bad comic book, Sam Wilson, Captain America.